from the inception of real project development through the point where we had the contract up for review with the Regulatory Commission in Alaska. If you ever get your project built, first thing you'll see is our lawyers filing a case to shut it down. That's a pretty stark environment. We had another utility sort of do what I would characterize as a bait and switch, bring us in to propose a seemingly competitive process to sell them wind power versus their own in-house project. They manipulated our numbers to the negative without ever consulting or negotiating with us. And then, in my view, they manipulated their own numbers with favorable assumptions to make it appear that their project was a better deal to their utility ratepayers than ours. So those are the places where there's a startling absence of government participation and oversight. We don't have FERC here. There's no separation between the transmission and system side of the house and the generation customer side of the house with these electric utilities like you would have in the lower 48. One of the other observations here that I think is pervasive in the state is, there is actually something of a deep and pervasive suspicion of for-profit companies within the energy space here in Alaska. We experienced it directly. I had directors on boards of our prospective and utility customers ask about the compensation of my employees. I've heard a rumor that you're going to get $1 million bonus if this project is built. That was an actual question. I had to shut that down. I said, my numbers are public because that's the way our corporation is regulated. You can look them up in the annual proxy statement. We are not going to discuss the compensation of my employees. And then the final thing is that I probably alluded to this, I may have even spoken to it a little bit more, but there is no formal place in our system for a private independent power producer at a commercial scale. If you want to get into this business, you have to make your own space, however you have to do it. And that includes seeking special legislative exemption from regulation or whatever means are necessary. If you want to be an independent power producer in Alaska, you've got to make your own space because it does not exist. So with that, I think, if you go back to the message I started with, all you said here, if private capital is sought, we have testified in front of the legislature and we've made other statements that private capital flows to where it is welcome and where it is sought. We have made far more investment outside of Alaska in this space than we have here. And that's not just a matter of the scale of our system. It is, in part, a reality of our system itself. Thank you for your time.
How long did it take to build a project, and how long it's been in operation?
So the question was, how long did it take start to finish? How long has it been in operation? So our direct participation as a project proponent started around 2005. It was constructed during 2007, came operational late September, so it was a 7 or 8 year development process with us as the project proponent. It was actually a concept, an idea that was studied with the utilities in the consortium starting in the late 90s. And so, it's a concept and project idea that's been around since about 1999, so about 14 years ago or so. Heavy development activity and efforts over about 7 years through construction last year. It's been operational now for 10 months.
And our final speaker on the panel is Mike Keynes, who is a distinguished fellow at Logistics Management Institute in Washington. Mike is also the president-elect of the USAEA.
Thank Shirley. Getting that ready, I must say I admire Ethan and Bronco for being so articulate, just kind of fluently giving a talk and all that. I find I'm using slides, so perhaps it's a crutch, but hopefully it will help with the presentation. The relevance probably of my position for purposes of this is that I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. So I observe the political economy of energy to some extent, and that's what I'm pretty much working out. Thank you. So what I'm interested in talking about a little here this morning, or this afternoon, is what is it that's motivating policymakers or policy in the energy area, and identifying and looking at one particular stimulus for this, the feelings or the momentum that we see in energy policy, and that is, where is the public? And what is the public conveying to politicians or policymakers about their preferences, and then how does that enter into the debate? Okay. So how does the public opinion affect energy policy? Where is the public? And we're going to talk about that a little bit, some evidence from recent opinion polls. And then finally, what, if anything, does it mean for energy economists? So how does public opinion affect energy policy? Well, it's only one of many items that policymakers, politicians, regulators take into account. Maybe an important one, but it's only one. Another one would be industry positions and information. What is industry telling policymakers about what the constraints are and what's possible? Non-governmental organization positions and information. They're a part of the public, you could say, but they're kind of specialized, and they have a lot of things to bring to bear on energy policy. Local opinion. What I'm going to be showing, and the evidence I'm going to be putting up on the screen, is basically national polls, whereas policymakers, and here I mean basically elected representatives, are listening to their constituents in their local areas, and sometimes what their constituents are saying is not the same thing as what is going on at the national level. And then what I'm calling economic reality, fiscal constraints, costs of policy, state of technology, all of those enter into thinking about what can we actually do here and where should we go. And finally, policymakers know that the public is sometimes fickle and attitudes can change over time, and they can't be sure that if they take public attitudes at a given point in time and move in that direction, that the public will approve it by the time that they actually get done implementing the policy. So there's that. So, where is the public on energy? Well, frequently, it turns out more frequently than you might guess, national polls cover energy along with other topics. It's often the case that there's polls with a lot of different questions about where the society is and things that the public favors and so on, and only some of the questions cover energy, but there are questions that do. In these polls, the samples are usually pretty high. They're in the order of 1,000 to 1,500 people. So that you get pretty good statistical results with relatively small margins of error. However, questions sometimes are sort of a little bit vague, you might say. They don't impose direct costs on those who are asked to make choices. So, you know, sometimes what people say isn't what they actually do if confronted with real-world constraints. How questions are phrased can affect what answers are received. I'm sure you all know that. And still, after all of that is said and done and all the caveats are in there, aggregate national polling results do reveal what the public is thinking about on energy at a given point in time. Before I move into what some of the polling evidence says, I thought, before I go any further, I should at least ask the question or think about, could it be that it isn't that the public comes up with these views and then the policymakers do what they think the public wants, but rather the policymakers are making choices and the public sort of hears about it through the media. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the policymakers are the ones who are kind of setting the agenda and the public is sort of following. But then there's some polling evidence that suggests maybe that's not the case. When you get to what the public thinks about those who make policy choices, you can see what the numbers, the most recent numbers are on approval of Congress and the job that they're doing. It's not very good. And even the president, who by and large is still pretty popular, I think, but when it gets down to do we approve of the job that he's doing, it's more people disapprove than approve. Then there's the direction of the country, questions about are we going in the right directions or the wrong directions, and of course the public would tend to think this is because we're going in the right direction or wrong direction because of what our policymakers are doing, and about 2 to 1 people think we are not going in the right directions. And finally, the political leaders are competing for public approval. It's not the other way around, and therefore it seems more likely that where the public wants to go is what the politicians will do rather than the other way around. So it's difficult to conclude, in my mind, it's difficult to conclude that opinion just reflects what the policymakers are doing. I think they are trying to follow what they think the public wants to do rather than the other way around. So who is it that actually does poll the public in these various and sundry questionnaires? Well, it turns out that most of the polling is done by groups that you're quite familiar with. There's the Gallup poll, and the Pew Center does a lot of polling that covers energy. National Journal combined with United Technologies, the CBS, New York Times, and so on and so on. These are pretty much the polling organizations that you hear about when you hear about job approval ratings and where does Congress sit and all these kinds of things. As I said, these polls tend to be pretty large. Plus or minus 3% is the usual margin of error on these on the results. So from a statistical perspective, and they try to poll randomly. From a statistical perspective, these are fairly reasonable results. So we start with where is the public on energy? And the first question is energy even on the radar? And where is it if it is? So these are the issues, the top, I have 7 issues from the public's perspective, and as you can see, energy is not the most important issue right now. The economy and education, healthcare, and so on are the most important, but energy is up there. It's not that far below the top 3, and then gas prices, which means gasoline prices, of course, is the next one. So that's sort of an energy-related question. And then it goes on down from there to budget deficit, the environment, and then there's others that are below that. So I would say from that energy is important, not the most important issue for the public, but it's important enough that it's on the radar screen for policymakers. They have to at least be somewhat cognizant of where the public is. So then you start asking questions about what should we be doing? What do you favor? What do you like and what don't you like? And the first question, these are a couple of results from the latest Gallup poll, which I think was maybe February, I forgot exactly, it might have been April of this year. More production of gas, oil, and coal, the fossil fuels versus more energy efficiency. You can see energy efficiency. If you just ask the question in that way, energy efficiency sounds good, sounds better than just more supply, and so there's support for things that might be done in that area. If you ask the question in a different way, which is, should we do the fossil fuels or should we go into the alternate energy forms, the wind, the solar, and other, geothermal perhaps, and other things, it's almost 2 to 1 in the Gallup poll that let's go towards the renewables. Pew asked a very similar question. I think it was slightly earlier and got a similar margin, not quite as great, but pretty large groupings there showing that the public likes the idea of the renewables more than it does producing more in the way of fossil fuels. But then if you break it down just a little more and you start asking about individual fuels and renewables, the solar and the wind and so on, and then you also ask separately about the fossil fuels, you find that natural gas is in a different position from the other fuels. It's actually quite favored by the public. Maybe they've heard good things about it, or whatever the reasons might be. They're hearing about the shale gas revolution, reading about it. In any case, gas does get a favorable response in these public opinion polls. Oil is somewhat favorable. You can read it in one of two ways. You could say more people think there should be more emphasis on oil than less, but you could also read it that if you combine the less and the same emphasis, it said, 53% think no more than what we're doing now, or maybe even less, and 46% say it's even more. On nuclear, it's pretty clear that if you combine those last two columns about 2 to 1, they're saying, hey, we don't need to be doing more, maybe stay about where we are or even less. And on coal, it's pretty clear the less is beaten mores on their own, and if you combine them into the same, do less or no more at least, it's more than 2 to 1 to kind of say, not do more and maybe do less. So then there are questions that have to do with specific policies. So for example, the CAFE type requirements require more efficient vehicles. That's in the energy efficiency area, obviously. Very, very strong support for this kind of policy. Spend more on R&D for wind, solar, and fuel cells, so that would be the renewables. Should government actually be putting money into these areas? And the answer is yes. We like that idea. Open up government lands for oil and gas exploration. All of this is coming out of a Pew poll, incidentally, from 2012. Almost a 2 to 1 response to say yes. A little unclear whether most of that is because of support for natural gas. They don't separate them here, so you can't tell, and they weren't separated in this poll. But in any case, the suggestion is that opening up lands is probably a good idea. Finally, increase the use of nuclear energy. The answer seems to be let's not do that. Maybe stay the same. It's not said here, but don't necessarily increase it at this time. Now moving to sort of some contemporary energy issues, things that are kind of on the front burner, we might say, at this time. Build the Keystone Pipeline. This is a United Technologies National Journal poll. Answer is yes, by almost 3 to 1. Let's do that. Then stop new regulations on power plant emissions. This has to do with EPA and curbing coal-fired plants and so on. You could read this as kind of slight support for maybe we shouldn't be doing this, or EPA should go slower, or something along there. There are a lot of unsures in this area too. It's about a half and half as of the time this poll was taken. That's the, let's see, 2013 again. I don't have the months down here, but I think that's a June 2013 poll. Support or oppose hydraulic fracturing. Pretty good margin in support of hydraulic fracturing. More people seem to want it. Again, this is, I think, largely associated with natural gas, and so far as natural gas is a favorite fuel, hydraulic fracturing is a favorite policy. So what about taxes? These questions come up, and there was a nice poll done by some folks out at San Jose State University Research Center. It's called the Moneta Transportation Institute. They asked a long series of questions that pertain to taxes, and there was a series of them having to do with a 10-cent a gallon increase in the federal gasoline tax. And as you can see, how you ask this question kind of drives what kind of response you get. If you just say, hey, shall we raise the tax? 80% say, essentially, 80% say no, let's not do that. But if you start talking about how these monies could be spent, you get different responses here. So reducing pollution, global warming, almost half the public says that wouldn't be so bad. Maybe we can support that. If you make it a little more specific, let's use the monies to reduce accidents on the road. This is road accidents, improve safety on the roads. You get a majority that say that they would support that. And if you go even more and use the words roads, highways, streets, let's use it for that to maintain, improve, whatever. You get a 60%. That's the highest that they got of any of the different questions that they asked. The highest proportion that would support a 10-cent increase in the federal gasoline tax. Kind of interesting, I thought, that you could actually get it. The majority of the public, and what comes out of that is maybe can you constrain the law such that if you did increase the gasoline tax, that you could constrain it so that you did spend it in that way, as opposed to a broader series of things that you might do with it. Attitudes towards a carbon tax. Interestingly enough, people were asked in a poll done by Yale and George Mason University, actually done by Service for them, but they were the sponsors of this poll. What if we impose a carbon tax with the monies used to pay down the national debt? So it's the policy, and here's how the monies would be spent. And by 2-to-1, they said, yeah, gee, that sounds like a good idea. Let's proceed to do that. But in the same poll, they then reframed the question to say, yeah, but what if we impose it, even if it would you be supportive or would you be opposed if it resulted in a $180 a year payment by the average U.S. household? And you can see how the numbers turn. If you frame it in that way, this is what you have to pay. If we did it, never mind what was done with the revenues, this is what is going to come out of your pocket. There was a different poll done by the Nicholas Center at Duke University in which they asked some questions related to the carbon tax. Straight carbon tax, no, consistent with other. If we put a $500 a person rebate in there, this now resembles the program up in British Columbia, where they do exactly this. There is a carbon tax and the monies are returned to the public. I don't know that it's a $500 per person rebate, but there is a rebate for the public up there. And we were told yesterday in one of the sessions that is not a controversial policy up there. It is favored. However, they are returning more money to the public than they are taking in. So that may have something to do with how people feel. So how do these are my interpretations obviously, what do these data mean for policymakers? So in the abstract, the public likes efficiency, it likes renewables, it likes natural gas, and therefore facilitating these through subsidies and other policies likely will gain, at least at present, will gain a favorable reaction from supporters, constituents, and so on. Coal, nuclear power, not all that heavily favored. Probably not a lot of political gain from facilitating these. Again, this is national now, and so at local levels things can be different, but this is where the polls seem to say. Public favors a carbon tax until it's asked to pay, but might go along if the monies were returned directly to taxpayers, but it would take a lot of explanation and trust, we might say, that the monies actually would be returned and that there wouldn't be a bait and switch here, which is where I think a lot of people are worried. And it might favor a small increase in the federal gasoline tax if the monies are devoted to improvements that affect driving, whether it's the safety and things like that, or whether it was literally the improvements to the roads and so on. And so my conclusion is if you can constrain the revenues to use to the things that the public says it favors, then it might actually be favored by, and people would be willing to go along with it and actually even support it. And what does it all mean for energy economists? Well, public attitudes matter to policy choices, I think, but these attitudes aren't fixed. Other things, many other things affect policy choices, including well-grounded economic analysis of costs and benefits of policies, which can and sometimes do shape public opinion. I'm reminded that our speaker yesterday on the question of the carbon tax said that something like 60 or 70 economists signed a petition that favored the carbon tax with the rebates and the money being handed back to the public, and that was submitted to the policymakers in British Columbia, who proceeded within a few months' time to enact the policy, which probably amazed the economists more than anybody else. But that happened. So economists can have, if there's good analysis behind it and good reasoning behind it, can have an impact on policy choices. Policymakers look to economists, among others, to inform them of the consequences of policy actions. They want to avoid unpleasant, unanticipated surprises. They hope that analysts with their modeling exercises and empirical results can help them with that. The ability of economists to explain the results of their analysis to policymakers and to the media, sometimes as important as analysis itself. I'm sure you all know that. These economists that did the petition up there in British Columbia evidently were pretty articulate and were able to explain themselves enough that the policy was taken seriously, the policy suggestion. So my conclusion on this is that energy economists are in a position to add value to public debate and policy choices, and I hope that all of us in this room will continue to pursue good analysis in order to facilitate such debate. That's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the panel. It's on now. Okay. Okay, thank you to all of the panelists. I would just comment that I think Mike did a great job of wrapping it up with the public opinion surveys, and you get a sense of how varied they are, and how one of the things that doesn't come quite through is how much people actually know about the energy sector and what they're commenting on. And one thing I would just say to kick this off is that if there's one thing everyone who deals with energy in Washington knows, is that energy is very different in different parts of the country, and it has to do with what's produced in a region and what's consumed in a region. It also has to do with the institutional history, the utilities, whether there's a lot of public power, which is the case in large rural areas and in Alaska. Not so much in other parts of the country, and it does make a big difference. Bronco, you were ready to comment here based on the last comments?
Yeah, I think it's remarkable. I did polling from 1999 to 2009. I did an annual national poll just on electricity issues, and very similar to my colleague here, when you ask people their preferences, they would say something, but then when you put a price on it, I remember asking, how much more are you for renewable energy? Yeah, of course everybody's for renewable. Well, how much more are you willing to pay on your electric bill? And anything above 5%, the drop-off was dramatic. Like, we pay a little more, but not, 10% was impossible, 15%, no, like 2%, or a couple of energy economists wanted to pay more than 15%. So that's it. The other thing you have to keep in mind is when it comes to the regulated industries, people know the price of gasoline. They don't know the price of electricity or the price of natural gas. They know their monthly bills. They know their monthly bills. If they're lucky, they'll know their monthly bills, or their spouse will. Sometimes you find out even within the family, that's not it. So frequently when people talk about energy and energy costs, they're really just talking about the gasoline price, and that seems to be the one that moves most. That's the only one that you see when you go to the meter. One of the advantages I think we'll have with smart meters, which really need smart tariffs. We had a panel before this talking about the benefits of smart meters, but you find when you make the presentations of the cost-benefit analysis that many of the benefits of smart meters can only come if you have real-time pricing and other benefits of the economic knowledge of the pricing that's out there, and that the great majority of benefits are out there tied into that with DSM, load shifting, et cetera, et cetera. So the public needs a lot of education, but the public is really smart. They figured out how to use these things really fast. By the way, one of these on average is $90 a month, an iPhone. That's more than most people's on average electric or gas bills. And so I said recently that a lot of American problems in the electric field could be solved with just simple straight fixed variable rate design. And nowhere would the fixed rate be the equivalent of an iPhone. It would not be the equivalent of your cable bill. It would not be equivalent of your home security system monthly bill. It would not be equivalent of your monthly bill for probably your car insurance. It would way be less than your monthly bill for a typical family of 2 automobiles for your gasoline bill. So we've got a lot of education, and the public's still pretty smart, I believe it.
Other comments from the panel to start? Questions from the audience? Questions, comments? There's a microphone up here. I think it would be best if you stepped up. So everyone can hear.
I want to thank all of you guys, Ben Schlesinger. These are wonderful thoughts to take with you, think about on the airplane. For Mr. Shutt, we flew over the wind farm and noticed that the blades were standing still. My wife, this obviously was a good-hearted effort to build a wind farm, but there's no production taking place. What is your load factor?
So the annual expected net capacity factor is 32.5%. Seasonally, it's much higher in the winter than it is in the summer. So actually, statistically, when you fly into Anchorage in May, June, July, and even into August, there will be a lot of periods where the wind should not be blowing. This year has been very unusual. We're significantly below the expected production in these 3 months, probably attributable to our record-breaking 70-plus degree persistent high pressure, very still, bright, sunny, blue sky days. So yeah, it's not surprising that you didn't see him spinning this summer.
I've also got, thanks. I also have a sort of general question for the panel, anybody, including Shirley. We often close these conferences with a discussion about the media. Our final panel on our past due have focused on the media. We had one in Washington, the media didn't show up, so we all talked about it anyway. He apologized later and said, I forgot to buy his paper. The question is, how it's, the way the media can affect public opinion, Mike, particularly with the kinds of statistics that you've seen. I've been grumbling, out loud for quite some time that the New York Times is on a crusade against shale gas. Still calls it a Ponzi scheme, never retracted it as of 2 years ago. And second is the most influential media organ in the United States, in particular outside the United States. When people look to find out what American opinion is, they'll go to the newsstand, and the first thing they see is the International Herald Tribune. That's the little column where you see American newspapers. And of course, that's owned by the Times, and it's telling them how dangerous fracking is. Next year in New York, we're going to have somebody stand up in the back of the room, and you can be sure as anything, and you're going to hear this. I read an article in the New York Times that said that fracking is dangerous, putting chemicals dangerous into the ground. You're going to hear this.